Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of our fall 2024 Kessler Conversations. These are interviews with top scholars of Luther and the Reformation, which we connect to topics that face contemporary communities. And this fall, we have most naturally focused all of our programming on politics under the title Justification and Justice, 16th Century Texts and 21st Century Politics. My name is Bo Adams, and I have the awesome privilege of serving as director of Pitt's Theology Library, which is the home of the Richard C. Kessler Reformation Collection. So today, I'm very excited to welcome Professor Candace Kohli as the first guest this fall. She is assistant professor of Lutheran systematic theology and global Lutheranism at Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. She teaches courses on Luther and the 16th century Reformations, Lutheran theology, and systematic and historical theology. And she's written widely on a range of topics that I think are relevant to our conversation today, including Luther's theology, particularly his theological anthropology and later pneumatology, Luther's medieval context, approaches to political theology, as well as the modern reception of Luther, which includes, of course, the good, the bad, and the quite ugly. Her newest book, which I think is set to be published any day now, is called In the Spirit, Human Subjectivity Under Law and Gospel. And she's also working on another, which is tentatively titled Luther's Enemies, Racial Formation in Reformation Theology. And in that, she's investigating racially productive theologies in Luther's writings on Islam and their 20th century reception. And I think some of that, at least I hope some of that will come up in our conversation today. I personally have really enjoyed learning from her about how Luther's theological vision had implications for his political positions, both good and bad. How Luther's theology was shaped and informed by the political realities in which he lived, and how his theological reasoning might or might not be helpful for us in the polarized society that we all live in. And I suspect you'll also enjoy our conversation. So, Professor Kohli, thank you and welcome. I appreciate your joining us.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for the collaborative nature of this. And I also want to thank Pitt's Theology Library, Candler School of Theology, and the advisory board for the Kessler collection for making this possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have these opportunities. So I do want to remind those who are joining us online that you too can participate. So there's chat and Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom, and Professor Kohli and I will have a conversation, but as you have questions that may emerge, please add them there, and hoping that we have time at the end that I'll be able to relay some of them to her as we move forward. So with that, let's get started. And I was hoping we could start in the past maybe, and a little bit of background that might help frame our conversation and our attempts, I think, to connect old writings, Luther's writings, to a contemporary context. Now, I'll just say for myself, I often make the mistake of thinking about figures from the past as kind of stripped of their own context, right? So this is the great Martin Luther as lone genius, thinking up a theological vision, undistracted by these, quotidian interests that might influence us today. That, of course, is not the case or was not the case. And I think it's fair to say that Luther's writings are just as shaped by his own experience and context as anyone. So can you start by helping us understand kind of what were the political issues of Luther's day in the 16th century? What were those issues that a figure like Luther would have faced and might have influenced his, more strictly theological writing?
Yeah, so first, what I want to say is that I actually think this is a really important question that even as scholars, we don't often stop and think or make a list of what the actual issues were. So you kind of prompted me to think about this in a new way. And the list really grew quite substantially as I started thinking about this question. So when we think about Luther's theology, as you're saying, we have to understand that his thought had as much to do with the political institutions and structures of his day as it did with his concern for the spiritual well-being of Christians. So, as you mentioned, a recent movement in Luther scholarship is to actually recontextualize Luther back into his medieval social, political, and theological world, so that we can actually see how he framed his theology to engage the pressing discussions of his day in each of those areas. When we do that, we can see a number of political issues rise to the surface. And I'm going to talk, I think I have 5 listed that I want to talk about, but they're in basically 3 particular categories or groupings. So the first issue was the relationship between church and empire, or what we today would call church and state. In the 4th century, with Luther, you always have to go all the way back and track kind of the reception history. So we're going back to the 4th century here. Constantine was the first Holy Roman Emperor to convert to Christianity. So his conversion initiated a millennium-long interdependence between the church in Rome and the political leadership of the empire. And the chain of command, so to speak, was always in some ways being contested by either the emperor or the pope, who were competing in their claims for authority over one another directly from God. So this went on for basically up until the 16th century. But in the 11th century, a major reform movement called the investiture controversy actually called this interdependence into question and began kind of opening up some space that allowed Luther some years later, centuries later, to actually then critique fully and openly this kind of political religious structuring. So Luther's engagement with this debate about the relationship between the papacy and the empire was deeply, deeply personal and actually existential for him, because his spiritual excommunication from Rome in 1520 also worked hand in hand with a then subsequent legal statute that called for his execution. So both the symbolic spiritual death of excommunication went in tandem with his physical death, or a call for his physical death. So now his 1520 excommunication was actually already in part because he was questioning papal claims to supreme authority over the church and empire. So he was already engaging this earlier conversation. But when the death warrant was handed down by Emperor Charles V in 1521, Luther's prince, who was actually responsible for electing the emperor, Friedrich the Wise, defied the emperor's execution order, hid Luther away to literally save his life, and then gave him safe passage in the territory of Saxony for the remainder of his life. So we have to understand Luther's political opinions and the way that he understood and talked about the relation between church and state, or church and empire, with this kind of very personal experience in the background, because that is naturally then going to inform the way that he is going to lean towards giving political leaders independence from the spiritual ones. So the second issue that I want to talk about is something that Luther kind of faced because of the way that he separated political and spiritual powers. And that is this question of how Christian subjects should then relate to each of these powers. If they're independent, then what does that mean for the way that a Christian would relate to them? So the test case for this in Luther's life was the German Peasants' War, which I know you mentioned. There have been conversations about at Candler recently. So from a historical point of view, I think that it's important that we talk about the Peasants' War as having both social and economic dimensions to it. On the one hand, and the way that we often kind of hear it talked about, is as some kind of class conflict, almost like an early modern version of a class conflict, insofar as the lower class peasants revolted against the ruling class of the nobility, whose land they worked and then who controlled the political and economic aspects of their particular territory. On the other hand, economic independence was also a significant driver of the conflict, because the nobility were using astronomical levels of taxation to try to force the peasants into serfdom. So We don't talk about serfdom a lot, but it is actually on the spectrum of enslavement. It was a type of forced labor not unlike tenant farming that we had in the American South after the Civil War. But it was a way of basically keeping the lower classes in economic indebtedness to the ruling class. So Luther's theological rhetoric against the papacy provided both the model and the discourse of protest that the peasants used to defy the nobility. Initially, Luther supported their protests because he questioned the taxation and saw serfdom as an injustice. But he was also acutely reliant, as we just talked about, on the nobility for both the success of his reform movement in terms of its spread and toleration, for economic support, and then also for his safety. So this led him to eventually side with the nobility in notoriously violent rhetoric, calling for the nobility to squash the peasants like a rabid dog. That's not the worst of what he said, but that was the part that I selected. So the third major political issue that he faced really had to do with the presence of interreligious populations in and around the empire. And now we typically don't think of this as a political topic for Luther. Instead, we'll talk about his attitudes towards Jews, or the relationships between Christians, Muslims, and Jews in terms of interfaith or interreligious relations, trying to get at the attitudes. But for Luther and medieval Europeans in the Holy Roman Empire, this was absolutely a political issue, because religious confession determined a person's status, rights, and privileges within the Holy Roman Empire. So interestingly, one of Luther's most common invectives that Luther scholars almost always interpret as a theological or apologetic critique sets Catholics, Jews, and Muslims in relation to one another as all three in cahoots with the devil in various kinds of ways. So they are all three the enemies of the true church, right? That's the typical interpretation. So as an aside, I call this Luther's unholy trinity because it's easier than naming it all the time. So we talk about this as a rhetorical device. It's part of his apologetic emphasis on the truth of the evangelical movement over and against Catholicism and other Abrahamic religious traditions. But because Christian faith was intrinsically connected to the political subjectivity in the empire, this invective also stakes a political claim to who can and cannot have rights within the political territories where Reformation theology had been officially adopted and tolerated. So then we have to think about Luther's attitudes towards Jews and Muslims and other religious diversity in terms of its political consequences and context. So let's talk first about Luther and the Jews. This so-called Jewish question. So Luther absolutely had this political calculus and background in his mind when he talked about Jews. And it's worth saying that when we hear this phrase, the Jewish question, our association is the racial policies of National Socialism during World War II in Germany. But this phrase actually goes all the way back to Augustine and tracks its way through medieval theology, through Luther, and then finds its way into modernity in that moment of World War II. So in the Middle Ages, theologians, so I'm painting with a broad brush here because I want to emphasize that Luther is not the only person doing this. So theologians, Bernard of Clairvaux, Thomas Aquinas, the list goes on and on, we're actually beginning to think in ways that scholars are now seeing as racially productive about medieval Jews. about their relationships to Christians and the roles and responsibilities political leaders had to their Christian subjects weighed against responsibilities to the Jewish communities that inhabited their lands. So medieval theologies oscillated between theorizing political responsibility to protect Jews, insofar as they were understood as property of political leaders, and then theorizing Jews as threats to Christianity, often using anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic tropes to do so, and thus depicting them as something to be controlled and dealt with. The historical record shows that most often the threat idea actually won out, as we see kind of widespread deployment of strategies to eradicate Judaism from so-called Christian Europe, either by way of forcing conversion of Jews to Christianity, or by execution or forced expulsions of Jews who resisted conversion. So this history would have been part of the air that Luther breathed. It was a reality and a political option that he took for granted. And in fact, we can really interpret his writings on the Jews to have the conversion mindset or model centered early in his career, before he then infamously shifts to the violent death and expulsion rhetoric at the end of his career. Similarly, Luther had to think through the possible presence of Muslim communities in the Holy Roman Empire and what that would mean for Christian faith and Christians who lived there. So Christian contact with the Muslim world really began as soon as Islam emerged on the scene in the 7th century. And it increased in hostility throughout the Middle Ages, with Christian military incursions into the Middle East to reclaim the Holy Lands from Islamic rule. So we call these incursions collectively the Crusades. Luther, and this is a topic we rarely talk about, but we really should, that Luther was very, very familiar with the theology produced in support of the Crusades. So one of his favorite medieval theologians was Bernard of Clairvaux, and Bernard was one of the primary theorists of the Crusades theologically. So Luther knew this theology, and he engaged those theologies as he developed strategies and guided political policies in response to the growing threat of advances from the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim, into Western Europe. So let's talk about the Ottomans briefly. The Ottoman Empire originated towards the end of the Crusade period, conquering Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul, in 1453. And then in doing so, ending the Eastern Christian empire of the Byzantines. Then the Ottomans expanded very, very rapidly into what is present-day Bosnia, Kosovo, and Croatia by 1520. So, just the same year that Luther is getting excommunicated. And then from there into Hungary, Venice, and Central Europe by the mid-1520s. And then in September of 1529, the Ottomans sieged Vienna. So they are just 300 miles away from Luther in Wittenberg. So to put this into context, I'm in Chicago, and Louisville, Kentucky, and Cleveland, Ohio are both about 300 miles away. From Candler in Atlanta, Jacksonville, Florida, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, are also both about 300 miles away. So we are not talking about a very significant distance here. And the Ottomans had advanced and conquered much more significant stretches of land than 300 miles in a matter of years. So I say that so that we can kind of empathize actually with the real perceived threat that the Ottomans represented to Luther, that they would feel this in their humanity. And it would shape the way that they engaged the world and thought about people of other faiths and thought about their own safety and security. So luckily for Luther, in his mind, the Ottomans were defeated in Vienna in 1529 and they retreated. But by 1540, they had regrouped and begun a new campaign into Western Europe. So the perception of the Ottoman threat kind of reared its head again. Not surprisingly, we see Luther to write on the Ottomans, what he calls the Turks, at both of those moments, 1529 and then in and around 1540. Originally, he opposed a new crusade, but he did draw on the Crusader theology to guide the Protestant political leaders in constructing and planning their military responses. These writings really have not received nearly enough attention, particularly for their social and political connotations, compared to other aspects of Luther's kind of theological imagination. But it's fair to say that the threat of Ottoman invasion really profoundly shaped all aspects of Luther's understanding of the world, of God, of the God-human relationship, from the start of his career, or kind of the start of his Protestant career, if you will, all the way up to the very end of his life. So the most kind of well-known writing of his on the Ottomans was on War Against the Turk during the first conquest in 1529. And this text is, I would call it like not necessarily very profound. Luther really kind of just repeats some of his earlier thinking about the relationship between political and spiritual authorities that he had come up with in the early 1520s. And then he also kind of reapplies what he thought about the Christians' responsibility to obey political authority, again, something that he had come up with during the Peasants' War. And he just applies it in this new context where there is kind of an interest or a question about what Christian responsibility is when it is a non-Christian political leader. By 1540, however, Luther really shifted his attention away from thinking about the Christian responsibility to obey political leaders to wanting to educate Christians on Islamic beliefs and practices as a way of bolstering their resistance for conversion to Islam, whether that would be forced or voluntary, and then also of discouraging their social engagement with their Muslim conquerors or potential conquerors. So we really see a shift from theorizing political structures to theorizing political relationships at a more social level. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail because I know I've already talked for a while, but Luther was also dealing with some side topics during the same period that really key into the way that he is thinking about Jews and Muslims as threats to Christians and the role of political leaders in diminishing those threats. So those are things like the plague. How do you manage a society during a public health crisis? What are the ethical norms that should be in place? And then also he's applying similar thinking to Jews and Muslims to the witch hunts. And one of the things that we don't actually talk about, I had never heard this actually until this year, is that Luther actually led the burning of 4 suspected witches in 1540 in Wittenberg. And just like he was doing with a lot of his thinking about Jews and Muslims, he was often including aspersions towards witches and particularly women, because there was an equation there between gender and witchiness in his sermons. So we see him not only trying to shape the political strategy, but also trying to shape kind of the popular opinion through the pulpit.
So this is incredibly helpful. I just want to kind of step back and identify kind of what you've done here, which I think is so amazing. Like, so within each of your three, I guess, buckets of political issues, right? So if we look at the first, right, this relationship of empire, you've not only highlighted the kind of big issues, but also the very specific issues that would influence Luther, right? He was under threat of empire and protected by a local governing authority. So that influences how he thinks about things. When we talk about the Peasants' War, right? It's not simply that this is an external event going on. It's that his writings were in some sense viewed as motivation for, and yet those fighting the peasants were protecting him. So again, there's a kind of personal dimension to this. And then, as you highlight so nicely, the threat of the Ottomans was quite a real threat, and it would prompt individuals to perceive a threat to life and property and all those kinds of things on the forefront. So thank you for kind of laying those out, because I think they're helpful as we kind of understand Luther as not directly responding at all times to these external events, but certainly having them on mind as he's writing. So if we can kind of shift from the world of history directly into theology, though of course those worlds aren't separate, let's talk a little bit about how he thinks theologically about political issues. So, I mean, I think Luther, like any good theologian, is wrestling with a general understanding of what is, the human condition in light of God and sin and these kinds of things. But he's not doing so in a vacuum. He's doing so in light of these issues. So how would you say that Luther's developing idea of human personhood would map onto these ideas of political authority that he's facing, in the midst of these crises or these challenges all around him?
Yeah, so there is absolutely a direct link there. So if we think about Luther's theology from a 30,000 foot view, so to speak, we can kind of see that he's working out two main questions and then their immediate implications and consequences. So on one side, he's asking who or what is God? And then what does this mean for the way that God relates to human beings and to the world, so forth and so on. On the other side, he's asking, what is the human being? And likewise, what does that mean for the way that the human relates to God and to the rest of the world? Personally, I find Luther's thinking on the human side of things much more interesting. In a lot of Reformation research, the way that Luther's theological anthropology, so his thinking on the human person, gets presented almost reduces it to a kind of mathematical equation where the human being equals, like literal equal sign, sin. But Luther was actually a medieval nominalist, so he was trained as a scholastic theologian, and he was reading and engaging medieval scholastic theologians like himself, who thought about the human being in a different kind of equation where the human being equals, so in your mind, like imagine an actual equation, human being equals intellect plus volition or kind of will. So the scholastic theologians talked about human sin as an operational issue in one or the other of the intellect or volition. And Luther very, very much utilized this way of thinking. That's kind of the thrust of my book that's coming out this week, that Luther utilized this way of thinking about the human being as intellect plus volition. And then when he talked about sin, he wasn't just equating the human being to sin, but was actually weighing in on those scholastic conversations and saying that he thought sin kind of fell and impacted the volitional part of the human. So as he did with most of his rhetoric, Luther, I think, really overplayed his game on the sin talk, especially in his debates early on with Rome. So his main theological topic in this period, because it was the kind of primary thrust of his critique of Rome, was justification. And what happens on both the God and human side in this process, right? He's trying to work this out. On the human side, he decides that sin is actually much more significant than what kind of Roman theology was permitting at the time. And that then necessitated total human passivity in this justification process. The humans simply could not do anything to justify themselves. They could really only screw it up. So on the divine side, then he inversely, so kind of direct inverse proportion, escalated God's agency and activity in doing the work that was needed to redeem the human being. So it's important to contextualize this as part of his rhetorical strategy, critiquing papal authority over the God-human relationship. He was trying to get the Pope and priests kind of out of the way as middlemen, so to speak, in mediating God's grace to human persons, because the Pope and priests were also human, right? So the kind of human incapacity also applied to them. But when he took this kind of logic from the justification question and applied it over into his political thinking, he actually duplicated the logical structure such that human and political agency continued to stand in this similar inverse proportion. So in political relationships, human sin also collapsed the human being's political agency in this period and increased the political leader's agency to control sin in the kind of worldly social political relationships. And the political authority's tool for doing that, in justification, it's Christ. In political relationships, the tool for doing that was the coercive aspect of the law. So, namely, kind of this threat of punishment if someone broke the law. So, in the way that Luther duplicated the logic early on, the political authority took the place of God in kind of compensating for human sin and moral incapacity in the kind of worldly relationships. Now, in Luther's early writings against Rome, he didn't provide many or any really options that could explain how a human being might overcome the effect of sin on their volition or their intellect as a way of increasing their kind of moral ability or capacity. Divine agency made possible the moral goodness required for justification, and political agency then made possible the moral behaviors via coercion that was required in the political domain. So here we see a strongly quietistic logic functioning in Luther's political thinking, where the human person is passive and subservient, and the political authority functions as the God-given agent for controlling sin, and as one really just to be obeyed. So by contrast, in Luther's later theology, he runs up against some of his followers who have used his ideas about justification to support antinomian logics that Luther fears will promote moral laxity amongst Christians. So he takes up this topic again. And what he decides is that he is also working on related topics for the Holy Spirit. And so he applies the Holy Spirit to theorize what happens when the Spirit is given to the human person in justification, and then the work of sanctification begins. And he describes the Spirit's effect on Christians is actually recreating, that's the word he uses, and rehabilitating those intellectual and volitional functions, such that Luther actually claims Christians regain some degree of their moral capacity with the Spirit's help. So again, not on their own, but with the Spirit. So what I find striking here is the social and political locus of Luther's thinking about the Christian's renewed moral capacity in sanctification, because sanctification is this theological and spiritual topic, but he is applying it in a political and social domain such that the theological has practical consequences. So this has a time-bound, this worldly sign of God's work on the human soul that Luther actually thinks Christians should be able to see in themselves. So in this logic, then, Christians actually acquire a kind of superhuman or supernaturally improved moral capacity in the political and social space that is not available in Luther's kind of logic to non-Christians, like the unregenerate, and in his mind, this would be Catholics, or people of other religious confessions like Jews or Muslims. So the interpretive history of the Lutheran tradition has largely focused on and reproduced Luther's early theology with Rome. And by consequence, then, Luther's quietistic political thinking is the one that has been reproduced the most and the most engaged. But the later Luther's theological and political rationale has some pretty dangerous political calculus to it that for Luther does not go here, but has the potential to set the political agency of Christians over and above other people's on the basis of the Holy Spirit. So when Christianity gets attached to whiteness, as we know it does in the European Middle Ages, we can begin to see a theologically legitimated discourse taking shape that has the potential to restrict political participation to particular groups of persons on the basis of religion. So while Luther is, it would be anachronistic to say that Luther is a Christian nationalist. If we're talking about common issues today, what we can say is that there is a opportunity laid out in the way that he thinks theologically here, right? He's not coming up with a political theory out of this, but he is thinking about Christians in the world. And it has some of the kind of foundational elements that we actually see coming out in Christian nationalism today. And it is noteworthy that there are actually specific Christian nationalist and neo-Nazi groups operating in Denmark and Germany right now who are going back to Luther's writings on Islam, actually, and using those to legitimate their ideologies. So this does have real world consequences as it's been received across history.
Yeah, and not to be too much on the negative, but you can see, as you highlighted, the early Luther writing has a negative or potentially negative consequence, right? Which leads to the kind of overemphasis of passivity of the human being, the quietistic response, these kinds of things. And yet the corrective side of it, as you've articulated well, and we certainly have historical examples of this, the overemphasis of the human's gift and ability over against other people to do this, to overcome the power of sin, has dangerous implications. And so I want to kind of lead us into where I think you were going, which is his writings on Islam is a particular example of this, right? So amidst the threat that you've described so well that he's facing, he kind of applies some of this theological anthropology to the other, that is to the Ottomans. So can you talk a little bit about how the theological anthropology informs the particular writings about Islam?
Yes. So Luther's writings on Islam, in the kind of relatively sparse treatment that they've gotten, have mostly been treated as apologetic writings. But when we apply kind of the social political lens, we can see that they actually have a social calculus to them that has a social impact in the way that society gets ordered. So to understand Luther's kind of social political response to Islam, we need to remind ourselves kind of two things. The first is that the Ottoman Empire, or the Turks in Luther's terminology, was a Muslim caliphate, meaning that the caliph, or the individual functioning as the monarch in the Ottoman Empire, claimed succession of the Islamic State from Muhammad. So this was both a religious and a political title, and in some ways brought together the same kind of religious and political fusion that Luther was worried about with the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor. So historians have shown that there was actually a pretty significant amount of religious tolerance within the Ottoman Caliphate. There were both large populations of Christians and Jews. But in the 16th century, all right, they're not working with the historical record that historians are working with today. What they were working with were supposed eyewitness accounts of escaped Christian slaves that were getting published and circulated around Europe, and which testified to forced conversions of Christians to Islam, of the sexual enslavement of Christian women in Muslim harems, of the forced labor and enslavement of Christian men, and then of rampant violence against Christian subjects. So we know that Luther knew of these accounts, and in fact, he annotated and published one of them as the Ottomans readied their advance again in 1540. So this is the framework that Luther is understanding Muslims and Islam and the Ottomans through. So in the same period that he publishes this eyewitness account, he also received a Latin translation of the Quran, which is something that scholars don't talk about very much, and wrote a preface to it for its publication and circulation across the empire. So all that is to say is that Luther clearly understood the Ottomans as both a political and a religious threat. And he is approaching this with historical information that is not what we would consider today as very accurate. But that I'm not saying that to excuse him, just to give context. So the second thing we need to recall when we're thinking about Luther and the Ottomans is the way that Luther defined human personhood as intellect plus volition. So this is really, really important for Luther. So we know that Luther thought sin affects human volition, as I just talked about, but he did not think that sin alters a person's status as human, or that that it affected their possession of the Imago Dei. So he doesn't go there when he's talking about sin and volition. But Luther, like other medieval theologians and philosophers, so again, I'm trying to suggest that this is not unique to Luther, but something that's in the tradition. Luther inherited Aristotle's definition of human personhood as a rational animal. So he's scholastic, he's studying Aristotelian theology and philosophy that's looking to Aristotle to define the human person. So this rational animal definition means that rationality functioned as a test in medieval theology to distinguish human beings from lower kinds of animals in kind of the hierarchy of being that they understood the world to be. Because human reason uniquely enabled humans to evaluate the moral or practical value of their various desires and impulses in order to kind of control them. So thus, this actually made humans uniquely capable of the relation to God, right? Because they had this rational capacity. So to just give an example of how this logic kind of worked, I always think of my dog here because my dog has a propensity for eating substantial amounts of things that he should not eat. So, for example, a human being could use reason to assess that maybe it's not a great idea to eat an entire chocolate cake for breakfast, right? Where an animal, like my dog, would simply eat it because it tastes good without any reflection on the quantity, the time of day, the stomach ache that will undoubtedly ensue, or the potential for rotten teeth and issues down the road. So likewise, a human could then use reason, that like maybe I shouldn't steal from my neighbor, or maybe I shouldn't murder my enemy, and could theoretically restrain those impulses to lead the kind of moral life that was expected in the divine relationship. So for Luther, faith in Christ became kind of the test of human rationality. Faith attested and provided evidence to the rational capacity, because he thought that a person could then use their intellect to discern Christ as the true God. So when Luther received the Latin translation of the Quran, he, quote, discovered, this is the word that he uses, that Muhammad boasts of himself as a liar. So making fun or mocking Muslims is what Luther interpreted. And he thought that Muhammad claimed to only tell the truth a quarter of the time. So he repeats this over and over again. This is a very, very big issue in his mind, that Muhammad would mock Muslims for believing himself, because he lies 75% of the time. So we know in the present that Luther's interpretation and understanding probably came from either a lack of information or a lack of kind of accurate understanding of the distinction between the Hadith tradition and the Quranic text. But nevertheless, as Luther understood these claims from Muhammad, his mind of Muhammad, he interpreted this claim of Muhammad lying and Muslims believing it nevertheless as evidence that followers of Muhammad lacked human reason. So again, I'm going to repeat that because it is so important. He interpreted Muhammad's claim to lie and Muslims' belief in Muhammad nevertheless as evidence that followers of Muhammad lack human reason. And then on this basis, he made the claim that Muslims were in fact not fully human. So in some of his later writings on Islam, we can see Luther to begin kind of theorizing or conjecturing what Muslims, quote unquote, really are. So some of those who don't really believe Islam are probably human, he says. This includes philosophers and physicians like Avicenna, who he names. And then Luther decided that others, people who do believe Muhammad, are at best only partially human. So something he claimed to be like dogs or swine, animals with higher levels of cognitive and emotional function, but nevertheless still lower on that hierarchy of being, and animals not coincidentally deemed unclean within the Islamic sacred texts, and Luther would have known that. So Luther's biggest worry is actually about Christian conversion to Islam. And that's why he is taking up this topic of whether or not Muslims are really human, because he is trying to think of ways to bolster Christian resistance to conversion. So this anxiety has to be understood in the context of the centuries-long strategy of forced conversion of Jews to Christianity. So scholars like David Nuremberg, Geraldine Hang, and several others have shown how the converted Jew actually inhabited kind of an ambiguous pre-racial status in medieval Western European worldviews. So they were seen and treated as neither fully Jewish nor fully Christian, because medieval Christians had begun to understand religion as part of a person's nature and blood lineage. So baptism in forced conversion just simply could not change a person's blood, right? So when a Jew was forced into conversion, they then began to inhabit this kind of gray area where they were somewhere outside of both social groups, but neither fully in either one. So miscegenation, then, the sexual engagement between two different groups of these kinds. Miscegenation between a Christian and a converted Jew could be feared to produce monstrous or demonic offspring. Um, and miscegenation could actually attach stigma and negative Jewish stereotypes, so stereotypes applied to Jews, onto what medievals often referred to as natural Christians. So people whose quote unquote blood was Christian. You can see how this is disturbing territory. So Luther, to what I have seen, does not use the language of natural Christian. He uses the terminology true Christian. But he worries all the same about what happens to a Christian as a human being if they convert to Islam. So this is really the preoccupation that he's trying to work out when he uses this rationality test. So he claimed that a Christian's conversion to Islam would actually be almost worse than being Muslim to begin with, because it would be the voluntary rejection of human reason. So the choice to believe a known lie from Muhammad, and thus a Christian, he thought, could actually lose part of their humanity. They could become only partially human, like other Muslims. And he likewise worried that Christian Muslim offspring would also not be fully human. So he takes this kind of Jewish anti-Semitic logic and applies it to another case of interreligious kind of sexual reproduction. So Christian Muslim offspring would not be fully human. And thus he claimed that the Christian women and men needed to really prepare themselves to resist socializing with Muslims under the potential Ottoman Empire, to reduce this possibility. So first, I want to say that we don't often talk about Luther this way, and of him having and participating in this medieval trajectory. But the ideas that he's espousing here are not unique to him. In fact, these were widely adopted social understandings of human difference amongst medieval Western European Christian societies. So we have three images here, and they are all what we would consider quasi-contemporaneous to Luther. So this one that's on the screen currently is called a V in a square map. And it is from, I think, like 1493 or somewhere right around there. So right around the time of Christopher Columbus, right around the doctrine of discovery, and the rapid expansion of Europeans moving into other parts of the world. And this does not look like a map as we understand maps, but it is nevertheless, in the medieval mind, a map. So what you have, typically, this one is oriented with the east at the top. So on the right-hand side of the screen is north, and then the left-hand side of the screen is south. So it's not oriented in the way that we orient our maps. But what you can see then is that on the right-hand side of the screen, we have Europe. And in this context of Europe, we have figures of human beings that are in the dress of nobility. So they're dressed as kind of regal, high social class people. And then in the center of the screen, this quadrant would map to Asia. We have depictions of Asians that we have to, I think, acknowledge and recognize are really, really reprehensible and offensive. But the individuals depicted on kind of the left side of that, those would be their understanding of South Asians, and then the individuals and depictions on the right, so this kind of bifurcated body, and then the kind of monstrous looking body where the face is on the chest and there's no head. Those are the way that they understand peoples coming out of what today we would call the Middle East. So oftentimes what you'll see in images from this period are depictions of Muslims in this kind of monstrous looking body. You also see them depicted as very, very hairy, where they start to look like animals rather than humans. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, what would be in the orientation of this map, the South, you see depictions of peoples from the African continent. So depictions of peoples looking like dogs, right, with a dog face, peoples with just one leg, so really looking like monsters. And then in the background, I can't see them very well on the screen, but they are obviously naked. So there is a kind of depiction of civility here. So you can see that this is, Luther's not just coming up with this out of nowhere, but in fact, he is regurgitating in his theology something that is kind of true to the day in which he lives. So okay. So this is actually a contemporary of Luther in Germany, which I have to thank Dr. Adams for introducing me to, Sebastian Münster. And this is a depiction of the continent of Africa. So you can see Spain at the very top. It has the basic shape of Africa, that it's a little bit morphed. But then you can also see like the Red Sea, and what would today be Saudi Arabia there in the top right corner. So what I want to draw your attention to here, in the very center of the screen, almost dead center, is this this figure that has kind of the 1 foot. Let's see, it's very small on my screen, so let me see if I can. And it says monoculi here, or sorry, 1 eye. So we get like a cyclops figure, which is also one of the images that's on the other map that we just saw. And then you see kind of the European sailboat that is sailing in to explore and presumably conquer this land. So here we have, whether Luther knew of Sebastian Münster, I'm not sure. I haven't had an opportunity to look, but it's likely that he would be familiar with these types of images. And then here we have that same repetition again in Luther's period in Germany of the Cyclops, the kind of bifurcated person. And we have Münster here then giving a description of peoples from other parts of the world. So Luther would have known this and had this kind of way of thinking.
Yeah, it's really troubling. I mean, it's interesting too, if you read around the Latin around this image we just saw, he's citing Pliny the Elder, right? A first century natural historian, as kind of the authoritative source on understanding what the African continent was like. So you can see that there's not a lot of what we would say accurate information going around. So I want to we're coming up on time here, so I want to push us a little bit to the difficult kind of so what question, right? You've led us through some of the really problematic implications or even direct writings from Luther. And I recognize, of course, we live in a very different context. I recognize also that you are a historical theologian. You're not a contemporary ethicist or political scientist. But I do think thinking about the process of translating all of this information into our world is so really important. So can you think of maybe practical steps or alternative models that we could take to avoid the kind of othering or dehumanizing of those we don't know that we've seen are so present in this kind of 16th century context? What should we do different?
Yeah, so I actually think that our context in a seminary for me and a divinity school for you is actually a really important location for us to do some of that work, because I think that we have to equip our students to understand the social power that comes with the role that they will inhabit when they become ministers, when they're giving sermons from a pulpit, and what they say and do is imbued with a type of authority and meaning that it may not be for other people. So I think that that means that we have to give our students kind of tools for self-critical evaluation in what they say and what they do. I think that we have to also give them alternative theological models. So as we mentioned when we were kind of prepping for this, I really worry that there is just something intrinsic in the way that we think about in Christian theology, the human person, human sin, what happens in the God-human relationship that predisposes theology to these kind of hierarchical understandings of humans. I don't have a solution to that yet. I'm working on it. But one possibility, I think, is to maybe look to like mystical theology, where ideas about the human relation to God is either understood as like the human gets subsumed into God and all people are participating in God, whether they know it or not. Or like Teresa of Avila, who understands God to be in the soul of all human beings. You just have to kind of dig around and find it, usually through mystical experiences. So, I haven't really looked at these kinds of authors with that lens yet, but I'm curious if there could be some potential there.
Yeah, I think those are really helpful. And back to your previous point, I think sometimes seeing a figure like Luther as a kind of negative test case can be really helpful. And of course, with a figure like Luther, that's so challenging because there is such this tradition of a kind of hero worship in some sense of a figure like Luther. And so what I find so helpful in what you're doing is to realize that actually there's some negative stuff going on here, not just bad writings, but bad logic and bad, dangerous theology that's going on here.
And that he's participating in his day, right? This isn't intended to villainize Luther, but really to humanize him, because we are doing similar things in our thinking today. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the other thing that we've alluded to is that he is a victim in some sense of imperfect information. And that's not to suggest that if he had perfect understanding of Islam, he would have written anything better. But I do think it is a bit of a warning of where are you getting your information and how are you stereotyping others. So we are right up at an hour, so I'm going to honor everyone's time and get us out of here. But Professor Kohli, I want to thank you so much. I have certainly learned a lot, and I suspect that our participants have as well.
Thank you.
I also want to remind everybody that your book is coming out this week, and so everyone must rush out and purchase and read In the Spirit, Human Subjectivity Under Law and Gospel. And then I want to remind others that this is the first of 3 conversations that we'll have this fall. And so all of these will be recorded, up and available, and I would encourage you all to participate. Otherwise, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.